31 October 1971. Halloween. Halloween wasn't Lavinia's favorite holiday. In all honesty, it hardly registered to her as a celebration in the first place. The Selwyn home was well removed from many Muggle dwellings, and her parents didn't see fit to do much just because the Muggles did. They usually handed their children small bags of sweets and moved on. William and Lavinia had grown up swapping treats. Lavinia's parents had a tendency to forget that she didn't like Bertie Bott's every flavored beans. But then, they also forgot that William, who was afraid of anything to do with heights, didn't like fizzing whizbees, so it worked out. They traded, retired to their rooms, and ate their sweets. Lavinia usually made a point to read some sort of horror story, just so she could pretend that the day was more than just a bag of candy, but otherwise, it was business as usual. In Hogwarts, it seemed, Halloween was anything but business as usual. Lavinia woke that morning like it was any other. She brushed her hair and twisted the ends around her fingers in a futile attempt to make it curl. Frowning at herself in the mirror for a moment, Lavinia gave up on that hopeless task and flattened her hair so it at least didn't frizz everywhere. Then she got dressed, pulled her robe on over her uniform, and sat on her bed to wait for Alexandra, Eloise, and Emma, who were all far more excited about Halloween than Lavinia was. I wonder what decorations Dumbledore will have put up, Emma mused. Emma was a half-blood witch whose love of Quidditch knew no bounds. She was generally quiet, unless someone brought the sport up, which Lavinia took great pains to make sure she never did. The end result was that she wasn't completely sure if she'd ever had a conversation with Emma, who tended to keep to herself or hang out with whichever member of the Slytherin Quidditch team was willing to listen to her rant for hours on end. "Will anything be up before dinner?" asked Alexandra, shrugging into her robes. "It's not like breakfast is likely to be themed." Emma shrugged. "Dunno," she said simply, "but I bet he goes all out for dinner. My mom says Halloween at Hogwarts is always spectacular." Lavinia pondered this information while they waited for Eloise, who preferred to take her sweet time in the mornings. Her parents had told her many things about Hogwarts, all with the end goal of making sure she was as well placed as she could be. They wanted her ahead of the field before the game even began. Somehow, though, they'd never mentioned holidays at Hogwarts. Lavinia hadn't thought much about it either. It wasn't like she was at school to celebrate. When Eloise was finally finished braiding her hair, the four girls descended the stairs and left the dormitory. Lavinia quickly discovered that Emma's mother wasn't wrong. The halls had been lined with floating candles instead of their usual torches, and Lavinia had to wonder how there wasn't wax all over the floors. The great hall, when they entered, had fake spiderwebs hung around the walls and pumpkins lined the edge of the room. Lavinia raised her eyebrows and nodded approvingly. This was certainly more than she'd expected. At breakfast, Lavinia loaded a plate with pumpkin pancakes. It turned out breakfast was themed, if somewhat subtly. As she poured syrup over them, the owls rushed into the hall, bearing the morning mail. Lavinia didn't expect anything. She got a letter once a week from her parents wishing her well, asking who she was spending time with and how her classes were going, and reminding her who would be useful to know. Lavinia always dutifully answered, sending the owl back the next day. Her next letter wasn't due until the end of the week, so it was with some surprise that Lavinia saw her owl, a barn owl named Paris, gliding down from the rafters towards her. Lavinia untied the parcel from Paris's leg and opened the letter attached as Paris soared away, keen to leave the hubbub of the breakfast table. The note was short, to say the least. "Dear Lavinia, Happy Halloween. We hope you enjoy these and don't forget to study. Love, your parents." Lavinia blinked, surprised but happy that her parents had bothered to send her anything for a holiday they hardly considered worth their time. When she opened the package, she smiled slightly. It was her usual assortment of sugary treats, the clear bag tied with a neat red ribbon. She untied the ribbon and opened the bag to get a better view of what was inside. Mentally, Lavinia could hear her mother chastising her for her lack of patience. Inside were chocolate frogs, a sugar quill, some Drooble's Best blowing gum, fizzing whizbees, and— her face fell slightly— Bertie Bott's. Sighing, Lavinia pulled the beans out and tied the ribbon back on the now slightly less full bag. Around her, her friends were opening similar packages, and she could see, across the hall, the same was happening at the other house tables. On the far side of the hall, at the Gryffindor table, Lavinia felt a strange mix of pity and superiority at the sight of Sirius Black with no package in sight. The pity dropped away, however, when Lavinia saw Potter sitting next to Black, hand him a bag of candies from the massive pile in front of him. "At least mine care," Potter's words whispered in Lavinia's head. She shook them off. Potter could have his pile of sweets, the git. It was a waste of her time to spend energy thinking about that brat. Once she'd finished her breakfast, Lavinia glanced at her schedule and groaned internally. Charms, flying, double history of magic, and potions was what she had to look forward to today. Charms was fine, but Lavinia was abysmal at flying. She simply didn't see the point of it. She could just travel by flue powder, which was faster and, in her opinion, safer, and didn't particularly care about Quidditch either. She'd leave that to Emma. Charms turned out to be the highlight of the day. Finally happy with their base theoretical knowledge of charms, Professor Flitwick let them have a try at their first practical lesson, on the levitation charm. Lavinia, who had been taught theory long before she'd had a wand, thanks to her parents' determination to have their eldest be top of the class, mastered the charm quickly, and spent much of the class laughing with Eloise, who had also figured it out quickly, at the sad attempts of the other students. They shared charms with the Hufflepuffs, some of whom seemed to be trying so hard to do the charm properly they were causing strange things to happen. Indeed, even among the Slytherins there were several odd occurrences. Instead of levitating, some feathers were smoking, others changing color, and there was one explosion. Lavinia laughed particularly hard when a Hufflepuff boy, his face screwed up in concentration, missed his feather and hit Mulciber instead. When the student realized what had happened and let Mulciber down, the latter turned sharply, looking to see who was laughing, his face like murder. Lavinia stifled her laughter slightly, but couldn't keep the grin off her face. When he saw it was her, however, Mulciber's face lost some of its rage. "Enjoyed that, did you, Selwyn?" he asked, unable to keep all the bitterness from his tone. "Immensely," she answered confidently. He smiled and rolled his eyes, and Lavinia got the distinct impression that if she wasn't who she was, Mulciber would be threatening her right now. Indeed, Eloise hadn't dared laugh at him. Lavinia shrugged the thought off. Mulciber was arrogant. He deserved to be knocked down to size every once in a while. When charms ended, it was with a heavy tread that Lavinia made her way to the grounds for flying lessons. Her only saving grace in that class was that Alexandra was even worse than she was, which gave her some comfort. After their second lesson, Alexandra had confessed that she was terrified of heights, an admission that had surprised Lavinia, coming from the soft-spoken and secretive person Alexandra tended to be. The Slytherins and Hufflepuffs both walked down to the grounds, keeping their separate groups and chatting about charms. There was a general excitement in the air, which, nonetheless, couldn't touch Lavinia's sour mood. Flying was a favorite class of many students, and after a charms class where they'd finally gotten to use their wands, many of the first years were practically giddy with excitement. Lavinia watched a group of Hufflepuffs who were practically skipping with joy as they theorized about what charms they'd try next. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She was almost jealous of their excitement. Almost, but not quite. They were silly, she reminded herself. She had more dignity than that. Flying was exactly as awful as Lavinia had expected it to be, and she made her way to lunch without much anticipation for the rest of the day. At least dinner should be interesting, she thought glumly. She needn't have waited for dinner for things to pick up, however. During Double History of Magic, Potter, Black, and their two friends, who Lavinia had learned were Peter Pettigrew and Remus Lupin, were suspiciously quiet, but awake. For any normal student, this wouldn't have drawn any attention, but in History of Magic, Potter and Black were almost always either asleep or else playing a game of Exploding Snap or some other equally disruptive game. As they walked down to potions, Lavinia became sure something was up. She was walking behind the boys with her usual group and trying to listen to them over the noise of Alexandra and Thomas Avery arguing about whether her flying or his transfiguration was worse. "It'll be fine. Geez, stop worrying, Peter," said Potter confidently, addressing the smallest of his companions. "I don't think you guys should be doing this at all," answered Lupin softly. "Pish-posh, Remus," exclaimed Black. "You're far too serious." "Besides," Potter continued confidently, "we've planned this out, and it's not like this is the first time either, and we've never been caught." Lavinia rolled her eyes. She could guess what the boys were up to. It was Halloween, and they were the champions of general disruption. Rowdy, loud, and arrogant, Potter and Black had already made a name for themselves in the castle. She had a good guess who they'd be pranking, too. They'd hated Severus Snape since the beginning of term, and seemed to go out of their way to make him miserable. Lavinia glanced over her shoulder to where Snape was slouching along beside Mulciber, and debated whether or not she should warn him. Of course, if he hadn't figured out something was going to happen, he had to be an idiot. She looked back ahead of her just in time to keep herself from walking full force into Potter. As it was, she just bumped into him, but he jumped and whirled about. "Watch where you're going, Selwyn," he snapped. "Then don't stop in the middle of the hallway, genius. We aren't even at the classroom yet," she responded, aggravated. "Can't you see?" drawled Black. "There's a slight roadblock." Lavinia looked past Black and saw that several suits of armor and at least 3 statues had been tipped over in the middle of the hall. Peeves. Lavinia cursed the poltergeist, who seemed to live to create chaos. She couldn't understand why the useless creature hadn't been banned from the school, but then again, Dumbledore was known to be a nutcase. Lavinia forced the embarrassed flush from her cheeks. She was not about to let Sirius Black make her look foolish. "Ever heard of a levitation charm?" she said with a pointed look as she pulled out her wand. With a murmur of Wingardium Leviosa, she began moving the largest chunks aside using the charm they had just practiced earlier that day. "Would it kill you to help?" she asked the general group behind her. Eloise and Snape immediately jumped forward to help, even as Black shrugged. "Don't see why I'd do that, Selwyn," he muttered. "Besides, looks like Snivellus has you covered." Lavinia could almost feel the rage crackling off Snape at the nickname, but to his credit, he didn't rise to the bait, instead just finishing moving the largest pieces of debris and settling back into place among the Slytherins, silently seething. "Of course," Lavinia said, beginning to pick her way down the hall. "I forgot that Princess Black doesn't do any of his own work. Can you even do that charm, Black, or do you have Lupin do it like your History of Magic?" Now on the other side of the fallen statues, Lavinia looked back to where Black and Potter were standing, waiting for the rest of the Slytherins to cross. Lupin looked vaguely uncomfortable, Pettigrew was watching Potter and Black apprehensively, and both leaders looked furious. She quirked an eyebrow at Black as if to say, "Well?" He curled his lip at that. "You'll regret that, Selwyn," he hissed. Don't think I will," Lavinia answered and turned away, the rest of the Slytherins following after her. She was, however, slightly wrong about that.